In May of 1775, a letter was sent to British General Thomas Gage here in Boston, the likes of which had never been received before. The letter was short, boring, and certainly seemed harmless enough. But this letter contained far more than meets the eye. Today, I'm spilling the beans on YouTube, and I'm going to show you what was really in the Revolutionary War letter that you were never supposed to see. Barely 10 days after that secret letter was sent to British General Gage in Boston in May of 1775, 22-year-old Benjamin Thompson was arrested here in Woburn, Massachusetts, about 12 miles north of Boston. Thompson was taken up by the local Committee of Correspondence on suspicion of being inimical to America, acting contrary to America's interests. Now, you might wonder, why is a statue of Benjamin Thompson standing in Woburn today when he was arrested here 250 years ago? Well, we'll talk about that a little bit later in the video. Just a couple of weeks before Benjamin Thompson's arrest, the Massachusetts countryside exploded like a powder keg when, on April 19, 1775, British troops famously fired upon Captain John Parker's company of militiamen here on Lexington Green. Woburn, Benjamin Thompson's hometown and where he was seized, is the town right next door. And at dawn on April 19th, the Woburn militia were already marching here. They had already been alerted by an express rider in the night. And as they were responding, they heard the shots, the first shots of the American Revolution as they were fired here on Lexington Green. In fact, the men killed and wounded by those first shots, one Woburn man among them, were still lying here on the common when the militia companies from Woburn arrived. But Benjamin Thompson didn't see any of that. He wasn't there. Even though Thompson was here in Woburn in mid-April 1775, he did not respond to the Lexington alarm, which only served to further arouse the suspicion of the townspeople. But this was not the first time that Thompson was accused of disloyalty. A cloud of suspicion seemed to follow Benjamin Thompson everywhere he went. He was originally from Woburn, but in 1772, at the age of 19, he relocated to Concord, New Hampshire. And after living there for only 2 short years, an angry crowd surrounded his house one night. And according to one of his later biographers, the crowd serenaded Thompson with hisses, hoots, and groans. This hissing, hooting, and groaning crowd, it's a very 18th century thing. We don't really have a lot of crowds like this anymore. The crowd accused Thompson of fraternizing with Governor John Wentworth, who was the last royal governor of New Hampshire and had become very unpopular. And they accused Thompson of rounding up deserters from the British Army who had made their way from Boston all the way up to New Hampshire and sending them back to rejoin the British Army in Boston. And that, of course, was the last thing that most Americans wanted. They wanted to keep deserters for themselves and pump them for information and not let them go back and rejoin the army and possibly fight against the Americans another day. The crowd that surrounded Thompson's house that night demanded that he come out and show himself, face these accusations. What was the crowd going to do to him? Tar and feather him, maybe? It happened. It definitely happened. But we'll never know, because Thompson wasn't there. He had already fled. Benjamin Thompson was no stranger here. This is his birthplace, which still stands in Woburn today. He was born in this house in 1753. By the end of 1774, he was back here in his hometown of Woburn. But far from being welcomed, he was reviled. That cloud of suspicion that followed him everywhere he went followed him from Concord to Woburn. Although suspected by his neighbors and fellow townspeople of somehow acting against America, nobody could come up with any evidence. But suspicions ran so high here in Woburn, the allegations of treachery so relentless, that 9 days after that mysterious letter was sent to General Gage in Boston, Thompson was arrested. During his arrest and confinement in Woburn, Thompson wanted to write a petition to the Provincial Congress, that Patriot-controlled, extra-legal governing body outside of Boston. And in the petition here, Thompson protested his innocence and pled for an impartial hearing, begging for the opportunity to clear his name. Thompson desperately needed to get this petition in front of the Provincial Congress. And he knew just the person for the job. That person, a major in the Massachusetts militia, had, not even 3 weeks before, led the Woburn militia into battle. First, coming here to Lexington Green, where they came across the bodies of the killed militiamen. Then, hot on the trail of the British, they later took position along Battle Road in Lincoln, which was the scene of some of the heaviest fighting on April 19th. This person was not just an esteemed military leader, but he was Benjamin Thompson's childhood and lifelong friend, one of his very closest companions growing up in Woburn. This person was Major Loammi Baldwin, and we've been talking about him a lot lately on this channel. Baldwin and Thompson shared something very unusual in this bucolic farm village of Woburn in the 1760s and 1770s. And that was a love of scientific exploration and theory and conducting experiments. Baldwin would ultimately survive his service in the American Revolution, and he would go on to have an illustrious career in engineering, serving as chief engineer of the Middlesex Canal, in which he developed a 30-mile-long system of aqueducts and locks to transport heavy freight all the way into Boston. I realize this is kind of like a tale of two statues type thing, but the men themselves aren't here anymore, so we just have to make do with what we've got, which is these statues. Thompson's passion was physics, and that's the reason that this statue stands today in Woburn. It's because of all of the scientific discoveries that he made later in life, during his time in Europe, and also the rather unusual fact that he later became a count of the Holy Roman Empire. A very unusual life trajectory for the son of a humble Woburn farm family. And Thompson's especial interest was thermodynamics. He studied gunpowder, firing power, the velocity of projectiles, ballistics. And in fact, as a teenager, he even severely burned himself mixing gunpowder for fireworks. Science seems to have been the foundation of the friendship that sprung up between Thompson and Baldwin. Other than that, they didn't have much in common at all. One of Benjamin Thompson's biographers later said that despite the cloud of suspicion that constantly hung over Thompson, the most convincing proof he had, the strongest evidence of his innocence, was that Loammi Baldwin trusted him. In fact, Baldwin trusted Thompson so much that he brought him here to the Continental lines in Cambridge during the summer of 1775. We are at Prospect Hill in modern-day Somerville, Massachusetts, but in 1775, this was Cambridge, the site of the American camp. Thompson enjoyed unlimited observation as he walked the American lines, taking note of everything he saw with his scientific mind and formidable intellect, his keen interest in gunpowder, firing power, and ballistics. The last person you would ever want walking your lines during wartime, if there were any doubt whatsoever about his loyalty. Back in May 1775, Thompson, as we know, is arrested here in Woburn. His good friend Baldwin does manage to get the petition in front of the Provincial Congress. A hearing is held, but yet again, nobody can present any actual proof whatsoever that Thompson has ever done anything wrong. He's acquitted, but he doesn't go back to Concord, New Hampshire. Instead, in October of 1775, Thompson leaves Woburn, and he makes it here into British-occupied Boston, where he throws himself under the protection of General Gage and the British Army. He might have even come here. These steps are the last remaining vestige of the Province House in Boston, which was built in 1679. You might have walked past these steps 100 times, never realizing that they are over 340 years old. And they are all that remain of what was British headquarters in Boston during the siege. Upon the evacuation of the British from Boston in March of 1776, Benjamin Thompson goes with them. He sails to Britain. He later becomes a count and is known for the rest of his life as Count Rumford. But the story doesn't end there. In the 1920s, a discovery was made in the Thomas Gage papers. Amongst those papers was discovered a letter dated less than 3 weeks after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, sent from Woburn, written in invisible ink. When, in May of 1775, this letter was delivered to General Gage, it probably looked like this. Short, boring. It's ostensibly just asking for some paperwork to be delivered. Nothing special, nothing suspicious. But once the recipient of this letter washed a chemical developing agent over the paper, it rendered the invisible ink visible. And so you can see suddenly so much of the empty space that was on the letter is now filled with handwriting. And the handwriting that appears is almost in a lighter shade of gray, almost looking like it was written in pencil. But it is invisible ink. Contained within this letter is intelligence about the state of the militia and of the province after the battles of Lexington and Concord. And this letter is in the collection of the Clements Library in Michigan. It has been digitized, and so I will put a link to the letter in the description box below so you can check it out if you'd like to. The writer of this letter says that he got his information from, and I quote, a field officer of the rebel army, if that mass of confusion can be called an army. Ouch. He goes on to say that he learned that an army of 30,000 men is to be raised by the 4 New England governments, and that army's first move would be to attack Boston and Castle William out in Boston Harbor. The invisible ink letter is dated May 6th, 1775, sent from Woburn, in a handwriting that exactly matches a certain petition that we've seen already, asking the Provincial Congress for an impartial hearing, begging for the opportunity to clear his name, written by none other than Benjamin Thompson. And the field officer who's mentioned in the letter, the field officer of the rebel army, if such a mass of confusion can be called such an army, is thought to be Thompson's lifelong and childhood friend, Major Loammi Baldwin, who, as far as we know, never knew that any information he entrusted to Thompson was revealed to General Gage. Loammi Baldwin went to his grave, never knowing that Thompson had betrayed him. This is the Revolutionary War letter that you were never supposed to see. Thanks everyone for watching. See you in the next one.